On March 31st, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his last Sunday sermon at Washington National Cathedral, titled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. Here's a bit of what he said. I remember so well when I first took the stand against the war in Vietnam. The critics took me on and they had their say in the most negative and sometimes most vicious way. One day a newsman came to me and said, Dr. King, don't you think you're going to have to stop now opposing the war and move more in line with the administration's policy? As I understand it, is that the budget of your organization and people who once respect you have lost respect. People, don't you feel that you really got to change your position? I looked at him and I had to say, Sir, I'm sorry, you don't know me. I'm not a consensus leader. I do not determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or by taking a sort of Gallup poll of the majority opinion. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a mold of consensus. He continued, on some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it expedient? And then expedience comes along and asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? Conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular. But he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. Dr. King knew all too well the dangers of speaking difficult truths. And he did it anyway, again and again. Here, he's transparent about why. He had to speak because his conscience demanded it. And he had to speak because he believed that it was the only way to move the people to action, which was the only way to move the nation's leaders to action. Dr. King tackled the most pressing issues of his day: war, poverty, racism, and politics, and he was often met with hatred and violence. But through the thousands of speeches and sermons Dr. King gave in his too short lifetime, his message remained the same. We must be guided by truth, compassion, justice, and love. On that Sunday in March, Dr. King concluded, if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face will surely fail. So however dark it is, however deep the angry feelings and the violent explosions are, I can still sing, we shall overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair the stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. God grant that we would be participants in this newness and this magnificent development if we will but do it. We will bring about a new day of justice and brotherhood and peace. And that day, the morning stars will sing together, and the sons of God will shout for joy. King himself was silenced 4 days later, but his message continues to resound in our ears. On January 21st, 2025, nearly 57 years after Dr. King's last Sunday sermon, and one day after Martin Luther King Jr. Day, another clergy person preached a message of mercy and truth at Washington National Cathedral. Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde concluded by speaking directly to the President. Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you, and as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals. They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen. Like Dr. King, Bishop Budde spoke. I know, I'm not done. I know, it's because I've already given 2 sermons. Now here's mine. Like Dr. King, Bishop Budde spoke because her conscience compelled her. She explained that after the inauguration, she felt called to add a 4th element to her sermon, a plea for mercy on behalf of everyone who's scared by the ways the president has threatened to wield his power. She said, I had a feeling that there were people watching what was happening and wondering, was anyone going to say anything? Was anyone going to say anything about the turn the country's taking? Bishop Budde took a big risk, speaking directly to the president in this way. And she has been both pilloried and praised for it. But as she said, it's not just the one sermon. We just need to continue to believe what we believe in and stand for the things we stand for. And that's the work, right? The great irony of Dr. King and Bishop Budde's work is that their pleas for mercy and love were and are so often met with hostility and hatred. But just because their words aren't always heeded does not mean that they aren't desperately needed. Even when compassion doesn't triumph, the endeavor is still meaningful. This week's Torah portion, Vayera, is a case in point. Vayera is not a portion known for its mercy. In fact, it recounts the first 7 plagues that God sends upon the Egyptians. But when God tells Moses to warn Pharaoh about the 7th plague of hail, God says, this time tomorrow I will rain down a very heavy hail, such has not been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Therefore, order your livestock and everything you have in the open brought under shelter. Every person and beast that is found outside, not having been brought indoors, shall perish when the hail comes down upon them. The hail comes, and as promised, strikes down everything that has been left in the open. And then Pharaoh says, I stand guilty this time. The Eternal is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pharaoh's statement is remarkable. Up until this point, after each plague, Pharaoh makes a promise to Moses to let the Israelites go in exchange for asking God to stop the plague. Of course, once the plague ends, Pharaoh actually changes his mind and keeps the Israelites enslaved. But this time, Pharaoh actually admits wrongdoing, saying, Chatati, I have sinned. And he acknowledges God, saying, Adonai Hatzadik. Literally, God is the righteous, or just one. Yes, Pharaoh eventually hardens his heart yet again, precipitating 3 more plagues. But just for a moment, there is a softening, an opening for Pharaoh to choose a different path. So what is different this time? An answer is given in the Midrash. Our rabbis stated, after none of the plagues did Pharaoh assert Adonai is just, except after the hail. Why? One who seeks to attack his fellow and overcome him will take him by surprise, kill him, and take all he possesses. But the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Pharaoh, order your livestock and everything you have in the open brought under shelter. In other words, this time God did not act like a typical enemy who attacks by surprise and shows no mercy. This time, God warned the Egyptians of the coming plague and told them how to avoid its effects. This time, God showed compassion. And this time, Pharaoh was moved, acknowledging his wickedness and God's justice. God's awesome power demonstrated through the plagues did not impress Pharaoh. God's compassion did. If Pharaoh had not been so wicked, so stubborn, and so set in his evil ways, he might even have repented in that moment and let the Israelites go. That is the power of compassion in the face of hostility. Imperfect, perhaps, but real nonetheless. Jewish tradition, like so many religious traditions, insists that mercy and compassion ought to be the building blocks of our relationships, particularly our relationships with the vulnerable, and the foundation stones of our society. It is incumbent upon us to remind our leaders, as often as necessary, of this fact. May God grant us the strength, patience, and courage to continue the work of Dr. King and Bishop Budde, and to fulfill the obligations of our faith, to protect the needy and the stranger, to love our neighbors as ourselves. May our acts of compassion be a reflection of the one whose compassion is boundless, whose mercy is upon all of their creatures. Shabbat Shalom.